Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, and here with me is my co-author, my co-host, the gruff, ill-tempered village smithy who lost both his hands in a tragic dragon racing incident.
Trent Hergenrader, I think.
Yeah, we cut them off because of the incident and then replaced them with hooks, so now you have hooks for hands.
Ooh, I'd like to play that character.
You know, like the guy who, the old horror story, the get hook in the side of the car.
Captain Hook?
Not that one, the other one.
Well, Peter Pan's a different kind of horror story, but anyway, we'll get there later.
This week, we're delighted to interview our friend, collaborator, and World Building Workshop case study contributor, Dr. Wendi Sierra. Wendi is an associate professor of game studies at Texas Christian University, where she teaches and researches the intersection of game design, history, and digital rhetoric. She's authored numerous articles, book chapters, and more, including a recent piece about Indigenous futurisms in video games for the Journal of Gaming and Virtual Worlds, as well as an edited volume about concealed identities in heavy metal music. She's also the lead developer of an NEH-funded game called A Strong Fire, which teaches the Haudenosaunee creation story as situated in language, culture, and oral tradition. In 2022, I was lucky enough to tour her fabulous new facilities at TCU during the Playing with Perspective Symposium. And if I can briefly editorialize, I've got to say she's also an exceptional harpist. All that said, welcome, Wendi. We're so excited to chat with you.
Thank you very much. I was thinking you needed a little glissando for your opening.
That would be great.
Opening bit there.
Oh, yeah. We'll really be in the big leagues if we can pull that off.
If we can get a glissando, yeah.
We can get a glissando. So, Wendi,
that's going to be the name of my dwarf with the two hook hands is glissando.
Get a glissando. Get a glissando.
Glissando, the dwarf. Yeah, okay. I love
Glissy. There you go.
Yeah, there we go.
So, Wendi, why don't you start by telling us a little bit more about how you got into your line of research? Because it is this really interesting overlap of different kinds of social forces and cultural items or artifacts. Like, how did you figure out this is kind of what you wanted to study?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard to know what you want to be when you grow up.
Mm-hmm.
I started as a literature major. I also did a major in religious studies with a focus in Eastern religions and minors in classics and Russian. And I did not like being pinned down to a single department or field or mode of inquiry. So then when I went to grad school originally for comparative literature, the narrowness of that, and I think that there are many people doing wonderful work, so I don't want to belittle that work, but it wasn't for me. I kept wanting to color outside the lines, which is how I ended up in rhetoric. I think some people criticize that about rhetoricians, that we sort of take on everything as like, well, it's all rhetoric, so every field can be mine. And that's probably a fair criticism, but also I absolutely loved it and started getting into digital rhetoric and technology and pedagogy and things like that, and had been a lifelong gamer. So as we were learning about these theories and things, I started being like, wait, I can apply this to video games. So that's how I ended up in game studies, was the slow path. And one of the things that I love about teaching game study is that I really truly feel it doesn't matter what major you're in or what your interests are. There is something in game studies for you. If you're interested in language learning or health and fitness, so much to talk about in like business or law regarding games. I think that makes it really interesting and enjoyable to me, because I'm always sort of bouncing off where my students are coming from and what I can offer with my scholarly background and what they can bring with their various disciplinary interests and backgrounds. And then in terms of like the native studies and the indigenous studies aspect, I am an enrolled member of Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and went through my schooling on tribal grants. After I sort of got established as an assistant professor and sort of had my, my battery of the boxes I need to tick to make sure I'm good for tenure, I started thinking, okay, I've been given this gift of this amazing education, and then from it, this amazing career to do these really cool things. How can I take that back to my community? How can I give back what's been given to me? And so that's when the work on the game, the NEH funded game, came from. I had community meetings, and we came up with some like really interesting ideas. Some people suggested, well, what about like Just Dance, but it's our dances, it's smoke dance and things like
cool.
that.
That would be cool.
Some people said, what about something Haudenosaunee people in northern, woodlands nations do a style of beadwork that's raised beadwork. It's not as common other places. And so some people said, like, what about a game that would teach beadwork, right? So we had a couple different ideas, but the one thing that kept coming up over and over and over was language. What can we do with language? How can we teach language, share language, create media in the language? So that's what we eventually worked on. And then from working on that project, I just started looking more at native studies and gaming in general. And it's funny when I have gone, so like I built a archive of native games at TCU Turtle Island Game Archive. And as I was working on that and, doing the very scholarly thing of like going around to all the local used game stores and seeing what I can pick up and what's around, I would tell people, I'm building this collection, I'm working on this. And so many people working in game stores and gamers would tell me, well, there aren't any. Or they would say, like Red Dead Redemption 2, right? The number of times I had people ask me if I had ever heard of the biggest game of 2019 was shocking. But there's a whole long history of native characters and native stories and games, and it's not talked about much. So that's something that I've been working in and around a lot lately. That was a very long-winded answer.
That's great. Less work for us. So, Steve, are you going to say, Trent, I think you got a question now?
No, I'm just letting you roll with it after getting in trouble with Kevin.
Right. Well, it's more of a comment than a question.
Oh, fantastic. I love those from male academics. It's
exactly right. It's a rare thing to find. So this is going to be a long, but I would love you to hold forth as soon as I get around whatever it is I want to finally ask. First of all, everything is rhetoric and everything is world building. I think we were kind of talking about that before, right? And it's like you can also kind of throw everything as design in there too, right? So it's like all those things are kind of moshing around. But, the rise of all the things that I was seeing in world building, the first time I taught a world building class was in 2011. And it seemed like that's when, just a few years before imagining or building imaginary worlds, that book by Mark J.P. Wolf came out, and then I was working on my book at that time. World Anvil came up at that time. So the first part is there seems to be this resurgence in interest, or not a resurgence, maybe like a first time sort of popular culture explosion in
just
the
interest. Just a surgence.
Yeah, a surgence in world building. And my personal opinion is that we've had media convergence, right? And then you've got these massive worlds of the MCU or Tolkien or whatever. And for the first time, you can access multiple aspects of the stories going on in that world from a single device, or at least a way where you're not going to have to go hunt at the library a bunch of times, right? You can access all this stuff. And it really created, I think, a generation of younger than us. I think we're all Gen X, Steve's a millennial. But I think even younger than that, they've kind of sort of they've come to see storytelling and participatory stories as being parts of these massive worlds, right? Not just I always say, you can't really do the Toni Morrison expanded universe or whatever, because it's like they're novels and they're all standalone, right? And they each have their own world, where it's much more like, oh, well, you're going to be watching a TV show or whatever it is, and it's part of this big, if you're trying to watch any of the MCU, it connects to all these different forms of media. So I think that's part of it, is that just the way that people are consuming media and the ease of being able to connect to all these different forms of media, and also getting away from the sole author perspective, right? Where it's like George R. R. Martin and what's her face, the Harry Potter. Maybe we'll just not say her name. Yeah, we'll just not say her name.
Voldemort. We'll call her
Voldemort.
She
right?
who must not be named.
As opposed to like Star Wars and the MCU have multiple creators across multiple media, and they can expand and proliferate 10 times faster than a single author can in the case of like J.K. Rowling or George R. R. Martin. So that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is sort of this in the world building aspect, which we've known each other for a long time and had very good conversations about these things, that the world is not a single objective thing. It is, our understanding of the world is all of these subjective opinions about it that are sort of like piled on top of each other. And I think, again, this is one of my things, that this is where I think the identity politics of the moment in 21st century United States is coming to a head, where it's like, you know what, the United States that you live in looks very different than the United States that I live in, right? And that could go either way, right? And it's sort of one of those things where it's like, oh, well, there is no objective truth to the world. It's just the perspectives that we're bringing to all of this, right? So you can think about the story of like Custer's Last Stand is going to mean a very different thing to a, person who believes in Western, sort of like the Western myth of self-reliance, and like rugged individualism and being out on the end, where it's like for Indigenous people, that's a story of like, well, hey, fuck around and find out, of a certain nature, right? Those are the kind of two things that I wanted to ask you about, because, looking at your book on world building in Skyrim and Todd Howard's role in that, I feel like a lot of like someone like Todd Howard in the game industry sort of backed into it. Like it wasn't a plan. It's like, this works. This is cool, right? It was not a theoretical sort of approach. But for scholars and for academics like us, you can't get around sort of the theory part of it. So I guess that's something that I want to sort of hit on, is that critical edge of when you're building a world, you're not building a world in the same sense of like a reality. You're building your own version of a world that you want to make a rhetorical point about the world using all of the tools of world building, and then letting people explore it in a very different way based on who they are, and hopefully coming back with some meaningful conclusions. But I don't know if that's a good question or a bad place to start. So more or less, like, why'd you get into this?
Wow, I have so much to respond to. And then the question that you ended with is like, not where I thought you were going.
Yeah, that's fine. I feel like this is going to be like ADHD joust. You know what I mean? Like you're flying around, like it's just whoever hits somebody on the head first wins. So
yeah, I want to back up to a couple of things that you said. So you mentioned like world building was not as much in the media that the transmedia world building was not as much in the media that we grew up with. And I just watched the He-Man movie a couple weeks ago with my family. And they were talking about when I was a kid, I had like everything, like every single He-Man toy out there. And I do think that like that was, that's why they had like lawsuits over this, right? Over the slippage between what was the cartoon and what was an advertisement. But like in a way, we were one of the first big generations for that, right? Like the toy from the show. And I don't know that I would call those toys world building necessarily, but I would call what I did with those toys world building, right? As I'm taking this cast of characters and these places, and I'm making my own stories about them, right? And playing with them or not playing with them. So I think it's interesting to think about how that maybe led to this, a sort of a precursor to this moment that we're seeing that is so interesting.
If I could just jump in, even role-playing games, like that's what I used to think about too, is like the Marvel superhero role-playing game, that was a way like a toy that it allowed me to create and then enter that world on my terms rather than having to reenact. Like I wasn't reenacting comics, I was like creating my own stories. And I think I hadn't thought about the toy aspect, but I think you're absolutely right.
Well, that's a technological thing too, right? I mean, the through line here is going from Gen X to Millennial to Gen Z. Like we're talking about technology as being the vehicle by which this expansion happened. And so you're mentioning He-Man. He-Man was like on the very early side of things I was exposed to, but then there were the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and there were the Marvel television shows and all of the Inspector Gadget was really big for me too. Or even Sesame Street. I think there'd be a fair argument to say like Sesame Street falls into this category as well. But all of that expansion and what became prosumerism comes from the expansion of the internet, the availability of building community online as opposed to in person, finding all of these other people who exist in the world in these other geographies or cultures who are finding value in this stuff and then starting to say, hey, I also told this kind of story with these characters. And eventually you start seeing a rapid rise in the number of fan fiction communities or spaces online, these message boards where people are using those same building blocks to start what I think becomes transmedia, or at least is sort of a more community of practice oriented transmedia as opposed to a corporate funded and pushed kind of transmedia. But those things existed in parallel, I guess.
Yeah. And the other thing that I was thinking about, you mentioned that idea of the single author, and it's interesting when and how appeals to a single author get
Mm-hmm.
made, especially for something like Star Wars, right? Where there's
Mm-hmm.
a sort of big debate over Lucas and the role Lucas played and whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. Is Star Wars not as good today because Lucas isn't with his hands in everything, or did he actually mess it up in the 2000s, right? And so even though there, you can objectively point to, well, what about the actors and their performances, the costume designers, his wife that did all the editing, or whatever you want to point to, right? It's interesting how that single author becomes sort of a locus for contention, right? And when we don't like something, we want a point to point at and say, this is what's wrong with it, right? And so I think the world building and the shared authorship, when we're loving everything, people are on board with that. And then so once we don't like something, we've got to point at Todd Howard's what's wrong with Bethesda. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's really true. And then Steve and I were talking about this when we were both finishing up and like ending our dissertations, where it's like when you do the thank yous, it's like, how do you not thank every human you've ever come into contact with, right? And like bouncing drafts back and forth and all that kind of stuff. And I
Hmm.
think that we're also maybe a little bit more open to that idea that all works are, in some sense, a collaboration of you and works that came before and people that came before, where in generations, for the boomers, I think it's probably a little bit more like, well, no, this is my work and I stand by it. So yeah, just sort of an interesting thing. And then also thinking back, I mean, one of the conversations that we've had with our friends that are classicists like Roger Travis and Kevin Ballestrini is to what extent were ancient myths more like transmedia story worlds in
Hmm.
which people were just transmit, and then like the book version of the Iliad and the Odyssey
Yeah.
is actually a transmedia version of what started off as an oral history. And I think you could probably go there with lots of native work as well, right? Like none of these things are going to be genuinely
Hmm.
native because they're all moving through these different forms of media that didn't exist. Just like it was not, the Greeks were not making video games, and the
Hmm.
Greeks were not writing novels. They were storytelling, and then the way that we've carried that forward, to Steve's point, is all tied directly to the technologies
Yeah.
that we have of the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also reflective of a different approach to story, right? I mean, a substantial part of the Christian early tradition is oral as well. And there is this desire to have one sort of ultimate correct version. And one of the translations of the Oneida creation story, one of the elders notes that there's like, depending on what you consider a different version and where you stop what is or isn't part of the creation story, there's roughly 40 versions. And there's pieces that are the same across all of them. So Skywoman always starts in Skyworld. Skywoman always falls from Skyworld. She always lands on Turtle. Muskrat always dies, grabbing the earth to spread to create the world. Was she married? Was she not married? Was she flirting with a lacrosse player? Was she pregnant before she fell? Did she get pregnant during the fall? There's lots of different pieces that shift around. And that is, from an Oneida perspective, fine.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to hear the version that you need to hear when you need to hear it. And the version you hear being slightly different from another version that another elder tells doesn't invalidate your version or their version. And that's just a orientation to stories and what stories do. And there's also, how does a new version get created and who gets to create a new version? How do you decide which parts can be played with or can't be played with that are related to that orientation to story that I think actually map very nicely onto world building? I mean, that's some of the
Mm-hmm.
questions when you think of some of these big cinematic universes, right? Like, how different can Spider-Man be and still be Spider-Man? What do you or don't you get to change about? And who gets to decide what gets to change
Mm-hmm.
about it? It's interesting this moment as we're sort of moving away from the Spider-Man is X, Y, and Z, and these things are immutable into something that is a little more similar to story work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, as you're talking too, I'm immediately thinking about Skyrim and Fallout 4, Fallout 3. They've got the through line of the main quest that you can't finish the game until you do all those quests. They've got a bunch of side quests that are optional, but most people will follow them from beginning to end. So there is a text there, but almost all of the meaning comes from how did you build your character? How did you tackle those problems, right? You know what I mean? Like, so even though we've all played hours and hours of Skyrim and hours of Fallout 4, if we were to sit down and talk about it, we would be able to say, do you remember when you went on that set of missions? But when was that the first one you did? Was that the last one you did? All those kind of things. So it's a really, and again, I don't think any of this stuff is intentional, but I think for me, it's always like there's this human desire to be able to express oneself in this way. And it just comes out in whatever form of media that we have. And these people, like, the people around me who are the traditionalist literature people. And I always like to say, you know what? The books that we have on our shelves, right? All this stuff has been around for like 150 years, right? It was not like that before, where it was like, literature was the one carrier of all human culture. That is an extraordinarily recent and short period in the terms of humanity. And maybe it's just obsolescing now. You know what I mean? We're moving on to something else. Maybe it'll all be in, Zuck's VR world. Who knows?
With or without legs, perhaps.
With or without legs, right, exactly.
I was going to say, this is actually a really interesting tie-in back to our conversation with Roger about recomposition and the idea that, for example, the books of the Odyssey that are about Telemachus were added after the chronology of the rest of the story. It was not written, so to speak, in air quotes, in that order. It was all stuff that was kind of cobbled together by different people in different places for different reasons. And Roger goes on to explain how the story of Telemachus is really about teaching princelings how to become royalty, right? It's about how to be a good servant of the family, the royal family and whatnot. So that immediately seems to me to overlap with the question about Spider-Man. How are we recomposing Spider-Man for every new generation, or even faster than that? It's sort of like the ship of Theseus, but maybe the ship of Peter Parker or something. Like, how much of that Spider-Man can you keep or get rid of before it becomes a different thing? But then there's also the indigenous kinds of storytelling, that oral tradition. And this is actually what I really wanted to ask you about, is how you think about the similarities and differences between those kinds of oral traditions and the other media people are presented with. Because I imagine it's got to be quite challenging to figure out how to take something that's highly abstracted or religiously coded or otherwise embedded in culture. And this is something you talk about with A Strong Fire, that you can only really understand a creation myth in the context of the language and the culture in which it's embedded, right? So how did you think about that problem when you were working on A Strong Fire? Or how have you come to think about that problem as a scholar of these questions?
I want to throw in there real quick. The other book you were talking about would be the Bible.
Yeah.
That one.
It's like somebody decided what order. I got bad news. Spoiler: it wasn't God who decided the order of those books and what was going to come in and what was going to come out. So I think that's to your point, Wendi, too. That Christianity is no different. It's just that it gets solidified and sort of ossified as this is the book. And it's like, well, if you know anything about translation whatsoever, right? I mean, that's why there's a million translations of Bible. So yeah, speak to that, please.
Yeah, I think that particularly thinking about the development and process of A Strong Fire, where we had the dev team that was entirely non-native that we worked with. And then we had, because we were getting an NEH grant, we had to have humanities advisors. And those were native scholars, but not Oneida and not game studies. And then we had Oneida elders and community members working with us. And so in some ways, I saw my role less as a sort of an active leader or designer and more as a facilitator communicating between my Oneida community that didn't have experience with game design or academia, my native academics that didn't know my community or much about games, and the game designers that didn't know the other three. And we were sort of always trying to balance against making something that would signal to Oneida people, this is for you. If you explain everything, this is a sky dome, and in Oneida visual design, sky domes represent Skyworld and the Earth. And this is a strawberry, and strawberries are called the heart fruit, and they have then that says to Oneida people who know that this isn't for you. I'm explaining on this isn't for you. At the same time, Oneida people were not the only audience. And so if you don't do some
Mm.
amount of explaining, then other people are sort of left out without a way in.
Hmm.
So it was a constant trade-off between how we dropped those signifiers for Oneida people that would connect back to the cultural reference that they would be familiar with
Sure.
and still kept things understandable for a non-native audience. And we actually a lot used the visual design and very subtle ways to try to communicate directly with the Oneida audience. So for example, when Sky Woman spreads the ground that creates Turtle Island, in our version of that story, she does so counterclockwise. And we do a lot of our dances counterclockwise. And so you get a prompt on screen telling you to spread the dirt and the circle counterclockwise,
Mm-hmm.
right? In actuality, to make it an accessible game, all you have to do at that point is jiggle the mouse. As long as the mouse is moving, it doesn't matter what direction it's moving in. But we don't explain that that's why she's moving that
Mm-hmm.
way. But if you're Oneida, then you get it, right?
It's funny that I'm teaching my Star Wars class, not to interrupt, but I'm teaching my Star Wars class this semester. And one of the things we talk about in the transmedia story world is like in Rogue One, if you know who Chopper is and he moves by in the background, you're like, that's Chopper, or they're flying the Ghost. And if you don't know, it doesn't detract at all, right? So it's like an
Yeah.
Easter egg almost. So it's like it's funny
I
that
was
you're
thinking that
creating
too,
a
yeah.
game for Indigenous people and you've got like Oneida Easter eggs in it almost.
Basically, and I think that connecting back to world building, that's one of the things that I think you're constantly being mindful of is what needs to be explained and what doesn't be explained.
Mm-hmm.
And there's
Mm-hmm.
never any correct answer. It's a sort of a best judgment and a constant testing with your audience.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Trent was saying about design, I think, too, or this
Yeah.
idea that design is interrelated with all of these other components as well. And, my job literally is to help people understand the relationship between psychological or cognitive processes or the way that brains work and how you get people to adopt new goals or practice some skill that they previously didn't know, transfer that information. The thing that I always used to tell my game design and education students is that they had the same job. Like, it's not any different.
Yeah.
You're both teaching people. And even if you're somebody who doesn't design video games or you're not a teacher, you do this all the time. Like everything you communicate, every diary entry you write, every time you go on social media, you're always creating something with some intent. And the question is just, how self-aware are you about that? Like, are you reflecting on why you're writing it that way to those people, or are you just kind of doing that? But it doesn't change the fact that the world building itself has intent behind it. It's
Mm-hmm.
being designed for an audience. And I think that was a really interesting point about A Strong Fire, that you're not designing this to teach, for lack of a better word, a bunch of suburban, affluent white students about all of these concepts. It's a game that is designed to capture culture in that moment and be able to express some important values while also acknowledging that this is not explicitly a step-by-step, here's how to utilize the language. It's not mechanical. It's meant to be a more cultural, literary kind of experience than it is a direct instruction experience.
Yeah, and when we came up with the idea for a language game, there was a lot of conversation about, is it teaching the language? Are we doing like a Duolingo, but Oneida, right? And one of the things that I was really struck by, I learned Russian when I was in my undergraduate, and I listened to so much Russian music and watched Russian media anytime outside of like the classroom that I could have the Russian language in my ears. I did. And I think that that helped me pick it up quicker and better and get more comfortable. I got more comfortable speaking Russian because I was singing tattoo songs at the top of my lungs in my car every day, right? And so those speech patterns became ingrained. And then, like right now, I'm working on learning Japanese and I'm doing the same thing, listening to some, visual K music and watching anime. And whenever I can get that language outside of a textbook, I am. But for Indigenous languages, that is very difficult because there's not as much popular media. So there is an Oneida dictionary that you can get. There are a couple books in Oneida. If you're near the reservation in Green Bay, there are a few kids' picture books and coloring books. People get grants to make little things. But it's just not the plurality that you can
Mhm.
find if you're trying to learn French or German. And so we decided instruction is already covered really well by the nation, and
Hmm.
we don't want to replicate that or try to usurp that in any way. But I always thought of my ideal use case for the game as a grandparent and their young child sitting together on the
Mhm.
couch, right? And I wanted something that a parent or grandparent could do with their child and feel good about, not feel like it's a test or a quiz or homework, but just enjoy. And so that gave us a very different orientation to how we were incorporating the language, and what we were doing in terms of like story and things like
Hmm.
that.
Mhm.
That makes me think. So I was just looking up because we played Never Alone in my house
Mhm.
when, years and years and years ago. And it was really curious that when you go and you continue, you end a level, right? Like you were just saying, the music and the thematics and all that kind of stuff is great. And then there's these hard breaks where they've got like a 45-second or a minute long video
Yeah.
clip. What do you think of that? Because it's in terms of like immersion, that's totally breaking immersion. But then
Yeah.
again, it's like, oh, well, this isn't just a fantasy game where you're running around with your fox friend, right? Like this is actually rooted
Yeah.
in human beings who are still alive on this planet. So do you have any thoughts about like what do you do? I mean, this is where I did Native American Lit as my one of my areas in my PhD, and that's always the thing is like, why are we always talking about 18th, 19th century Indians when we're not
Hmm.
talking about 21st century Indians, right? And it's like, and
Yeah.
that's one of those things. I think that was the design move back there. It's like this isn't about ancient times. This isn't. These are practices that are
Hmm.
happening, but it's also kind of jarring. But that may rhetorically work. So I don't know. What did you think about that? And like, how do you take that on? Because that was a fairly big game, right? And that was
Hmm.
out years before yours was. So that like,
Yeah.
to what extent did that kind of technique, that storytelling technique, where it broke like that, influence you, or is that something that you liked or didn't like, or just thought they did their own thing? We're going to do our own.
Yeah, I think Never Alone is really, really interesting. It's always the one that people want to talk about when they want to talk about like Indigenous determined game design and things like that. And I have taught it many times. I teach it both in my games and learning class, and I teach a Native American pop culture class. So I teach that
Mhm.
game in both of those. And when I have had students play it, I don't tell them what to do. I just say, play for, like, we're going to put this on and we're going to play for 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Only once have I ever had students go to those little mini documentaries, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, on one hand, I think they're very cool. I think Never Alone is interesting in that it tells a traditional tale, but with some twists. So, like in the traditional story, the main character is male, but the community decided that they felt like it was more important, especially in a like an era of MMIW crisis and things like that, to have a female main character there. So that's really cool. But again, it is a traditional tale set in sort of folkloric
Yep.
times.
Yep.
And so having those documentaries lets you see the real people that are involved in the creation, what they're doing right now, where they're living right now. At the same time, in my experience of observing students, no one watches those.
You
And I
excluded, yeah.
do, yeah, I have to assign them. I assign them to them and say
Yeah.
like, okay, now go watch these. So yeah, it's an interesting tension to think about what you do. And ultimately, because my game, it's a creation story. So you're
Right.
not seeing contemporary Oneida people in the game itself. And that's
Mhm.
something that I struggled with. And that is actually something that I talked to the Native Scholars group about. And what we ultimately came to is no one game can do everything. And I think when we think about media and representation of minoritized people and cultures in media, we often want one story to do everything,
Yep.
right? Like
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Black Panther has to be perfect. It has to be the perfect representation of a Black superhero, or it's not good enough,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And I think that that is more a problem of the media than it is of any individual text, because we wouldn't expect
Mhm.
a single white text, I'm sorry, a single text about a white person to perfectly tell the story
Right.
of all white people. Like
Right.
that's ridiculous. But that often is the case for like this native game.
Yep.
should be the perfect representation. It should have
Yep.
our culture and our contemporary people, and it should break down all these stereotypes, and it should share the language and share the values. And
Yep.
that's too much to put on
Right. Well,
one
and
thing.
that's one of the things that I mean, I worry, not like it super keeps me up at night, but this is one of the things that I worry about when we have these texts that do tell the one story, like Red Dead Redemption or whatever it is, that it's like, we've done that now. We've done justice to these people, and it gets solidified in one vision that's usually a pretty palatable one for white people. And then on top of it, the big difference between oral storytelling and, traditions of the way that these things emerged is that these are commercial products now, right? Where it's like, you're not, you're not trying to make a product for a global audience to play this video game, right? You're just trying to find an audience, where the expectations of Red Dead Redemption 2 and Black Panther are to get a massive global audience and get millions of dollars. And I don't think, it absolutely impacts the kind of stories that they think are going to be palatable to a broad, diverse audience. But then, like you say, what you just need is, it's not that that's bad. You just need lots of counters, lots of different diversity, and without the funding and without, the market analysis that shows if you make a game that's going to be for, indigenous themes, is that going to sell enough units to make it worthwhile, right? And it's like, well, those aren't really the questions that, the bards of old and storytellers and, tribal councils were really worried about. And it does worry me that it's like, you got to sanitize everything to the point at which it's not too sharp. But it's like, oh, but that history was, I remember reading a long thing on Red Dead Redemption 2 about the way that women suffragists are portrayed in the game. And there's I don't know if you've seen it, there's an extra credit video that's on tangential learning. And I wish I could remove it from the history of like ever being made, because it's basically saying you learn things about history from playing these games, right? And that's sort of like you learn history from reading a history book. You read that history book and then you're done. Right? Like you've learned it. And it's like, that's not at all the way it works. The reason why people are historians is because they read hundreds of history books and have those debates, where I feel like for minority populations, it's so easy to distill it and then have everybody who's part of that dominant hegemonic class be like, oh, we nailed it. We gave them space to tell their story. And it's like, okay, but there's a whole bunch of stories, and like you're saying, if you're in that folkloric time period or you're in the early 20th century, then to what extent are you unintentionally or unavoidably getting into that sort of like it's a disappearing race kind of thing, right? As opposed to like you need to have a story that's set in downtown Minneapolis today or whatever it is. So they're all big questions that I don't think anybody's really worked out, because these games and these texts and these narratives and these stories are trying to do different things for different populations, and the demands are very different from what they were when they came about from the cultures and the people who were creating them to begin with.
Yeah, I have two big thoughts. I've put them in a Google Doc, so I make sure to come back to them. So one of the things that you talked about was like these sort of big, massive productions, whether we're talking about movies like Black Panther, or we're talking about video games like, I don't know, anything coming out of EA, right? Any AAA studio. And I personally find in nearly all media, there are some things happening at that big level that I'm interested in. I absolutely loved Silent Hill F, right? Thought that was super cool. I did go see the most recent Spider-Man movie, which is maybe why I keep referencing it. But the things that really excite me are the things that are happening at an indie level.
At the indies, yeah.
And I do feel like there is this sort of problem across music, movies, games, where the cost, just the production and the marketing cost, is so massive that in order to make something that will succeed there, you sort of have to appeal to the most common denominators. And it's much harder to get niche and nuanced in anything you want to do. I was talking to some friends the other day, and I was like, I could talk about my taste in music, and it's nobody that you're going to know. And I don't say that out of some sense of elitism, but like, I like some really weird niche stuff. Like, I have my favorite Viking metal history band and my favorite Canadian female-led goth group, right? And like, that should not be something that the entire world likes. That's a niche interest, but it's mine and I love it. And I think about a lot of gaming in that way too. People aren't really able to experiment as much with stories or mechanics at that massive level. But when things start at a lower level, sometimes they they trickle up, right?
Yeah.
The one time when trickle up.
Yeah. Works, right?
Yeah, so so that's sort of my thoughts about media fragmentation.
Mm-hmm.
I agree that it's out there because if you're only playing AAA games, I think the last time you really got an interesting native character was like Assassin's Creed 3.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so yeah, that's an issue. But I also think there's lots of stuff, cool stuff happening at the indie space. And
Mm-hmm.
instead of being concerned about, how do we get EA to treat native cultures appropriately, I'm more interested in how do we support these indie developers that are doing cool things,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe that rises up and EA sees that and pays attention, or maybe it doesn't, and we keep doing
Mm-hmm.
our own cool thing down here. So that's one thought. And then the other thought, you brought up a little bit about like stereotypes in media. And there's a lot of research about native stereotypes in
Yes.
media. But one of the things that I think about is, oh, actually, I will quiz you.
Ooh.
How many federally recognized native nations are there in the US?
Ooh, that's a great question. I don't know. Steve, do you know?
Guess a
I have
number.
no
Give me a
idea.
number. What's your number? Ballpark it.
My ballpark would be recognized would be like 86, and then like the reality would probably be more like into the low hundreds, I would think.
What's your guess, Stephen?
I was gonna be more, I guess, conservative or pessimistic and say maybe the number of recognized would be around 60, and then the number of actual would be at least twice as many.
575.
Is how many are recognized?
575 federally recognized nations.
Wow.
You want to guess population? Like number of people in the US? After that showing, no.
After that showing, yeah, I'm going to say low. I'm going to say low.
5 million, 5 to 7 million is the number that you see tossed about. Now, that's a problematic number because it's focusing on census data.
Right.
And they're not verifying. There are native people that don't want to tell the US government for very good reason that they're native, because there's generational trauma, right? The last residential school closed in the 90s. So
That's crazy. Yeah.
it's sometimes people think that, we're talking about things that were 150, 200 years ago. No, it's people's parents and grandparents that we're talking about. It's people that
Right.
are still alive right now that we're talking about. But so there's reasons that native people don't want to say to the census, I'm native. And then there are also people that have, the Elizabeth Warren problem, right? The family history that says that we're native. And so they tick the box. But estimates between 5 to 10 million are what you see. So between 3 to 5% of the
Okay. That's bigger than I would have
US
thought. Yep.
population. But those populations are generally sort of collected into particular population centers. And if you're not near one, you might not know, certainly not from US public K to 12 history, you might not know a lot of native cultures. And then if you are not near a reservation, or if you are, but you don't go to powwows or things like that, you might not know anything. You might not have a native friend, right? And so then the only access to what is native culture and who are native people are through media. And this is something that I think is really interesting to think about broadly. If you've never met somebody from Texas, what are your perceptions of Texas, and how does media shape your perception? If you don't know anybody that's in a single parent family, how does media shape your perception, and how you understand the struggles and what those people value, right? The question of learning from media, I think, is something that's very important to think about and to balance against, like you mentioned history books, right? Like we all took history in, K to 12, and then we probably had to take at least a couple history classes in college. Maybe we watched the History Channel. Maybe we listened to Sabaton and, learn about the Bismarck that way, right? Or we play World of Tanks or something, right? But for certain topics, we are picking up information all of the time, and we're balancing that information against a whole ton of other resources, consciously or subconsciously. But for things that we don't know a lot about, Red Dead Redemption becomes
Right.
native people in the West, because you don't have anything else to reference, right?
Right.
And so then that's the flip side of like, oh, actually, maybe that media fragmentation is bad, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
sort of the utopian, this is what's happening and it's amazing. And then there's like the, oh, but if it doesn't get out to the masses, then what's getting reinforced by what's out there?
Yeah, that's interesting too. Like as you say that, because I'm thinking about my Native American lit class, one of the best classes that probably the single best class that I took in grad school, and I fell in love with Louise Erdrich in that class, and you know other great Native writers who I'd never heard of before. But how many of those books have been turned into movies or miniseries or exist in any other media? And it's not many. And what you find in Star Wars too is in the novels specifically, they're more willing to be political. There's more same-sex relationships. There's all these things that it's like, we know the people who are going to pick up a book is a different audience than the people who are going to play a video game or watch a TV show or whatever. So what you can quote unquote get away with, you know what I mean, in terms of what you're going to be able to allow in that form of media, changes quite a bit based on the expected audience. And then that totally changes again when you start thinking about, what was it, Reservation Dogs? Is that the one that was? Yeah. So it's like when you start breaking into bigger media, then it's like, oh, well, you're kind of challenging this other vision that has been built up, right? And then it creates all sorts of interesting conflict. But that's where my answer for all of these things is always just more of everything all the time and have more conversations and have more people in. I was talking to somebody too, I can't remember when, but like, you know, I got fairly familiar with the Ojibwa, you know, and Anishinaabe and all that stuff that's up in Minnesota and Wisconsin, because that was really kind of the focus. It's like, well, that has almost nothing to do with what's going on in the Southwest. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, those people were not in regular contact, you know, whatever, but it's like, they're all native. You know what I mean? It's all the same. And that's where, too, it's like, as you become more educated, your mind opens up to all the things that you don't even begin to know you didn't know about. And you know, this is one of the recurring things in Steve and I's most recent book, is that you resort to generalizations to deal with that massive complexity. It's too much for you to take on without becoming a PhD and, you know, whatever. So then we just resort to oversimplifying.
Who wants to do that?
And who wants to do that, right? All right? Only morons want to do that. But then it resorts back into, well, then if there's only going to be a couple representations, what are those representations going to be? And then that's what reaches the masses. So I don't know. It's a really sticky problem. But I do think the other thing I wanted to ask you about, if I can transition, and sorry, Steve, if I'm dominating the conversation, but what do you think about the difference between digital and analog games as a way of getting these questions out there? Because a digital game, I know this from my own experience of talking with you, getting the resources to build a digital game is immense.
Yes.
Building the resources to do an analog game is nothing. You know what I mean? You get some note cards, you get some pebbles, you know what I mean? And you're ready to go. You can make an analog game. And the question of what audiences you can reach, I think, are starting to change a little bit as well. So do you have any thoughts about that as to like people who want to be expressing things in games that they're not seeing, like what the analog versus digital offers?
Yeah, I think for a strong fire, it was really important to me that people heard Oneida language spoken, that people heard music from a native composer with traditional styles, that people saw artwork that was based on samples from an Oneida artist. So I really approached the game as being a holistic cultural experience in a way, right? Like you're hearing the stuff, you're reading the words, you're seeing the art. It's all coming together like that, right? But as you mentioned, the challenge of that was it was very expensive. We made a vertical slice. We always hoped to do more, and then funding became increasingly challenging. And here we are. And in fact, right now, it's lost in a cloud server that I am trying to figure out how to retrieve because the company that helped make it with me went under.
Right, exactly. Lost in the clouds. I love that. It's a very real problem.
Sustainability for digital projects, and even before it was lost in the clouds, I was paying out of my own pocket for the server and hosting and domain name costs. Because we got a grant to create it, but then nothing to sustain it, right? That's sort of the flip side is there's a lot of really amazing things, particularly like for Oneida culture. Like I said, I generally assume that people have not heard Oneida language spoken. Just seems like that's a good baseline. And so that felt really important for that project. But then it comes with all of these challenges that I don't think that we've navigated near as well as we did the initial design. And I didn't have them in my mind when I started that project, in ways that have shaped what I think about how I might work on future projects. The other thing that I think can be good about a digital game is that they are constrained systems. And so you potentially limit how people can enact the things that they are importing from their own experience, which is potentially a good thing. And here I'm thinking specifically of Coyote and Crow.
I was just going to say, yeah, that's exactly where my brain went, but keep going.
Which is a tabletop RPG that was created by an Indigenous team, predominantly Indigenous team, I believe. I can't recall if they were 100% Indigenous or not. But the idea is that there was a climate disaster in like 1400, and so contact never happened. And the Indigenous cultures of America were able to develop without, I mean, every culture in the world was developed without any interference, right? Everybody becomes geographically isolated, essentially. And they have a note at the beginning of the book, like a note for non-native players. You just kind of say, like, be respectful, maybe think twice about taking on an identity that's not yours or a name that's not yours, like be mindful of the choices that you're making. So they want non-native people to play, but they're also asking people to do something that at the end of the day, the system never checks to make sure you're doing.
Right. There's no mechanics. Yeah.
And so I think that the cool thing about analog, it's in some ways quicker and easier to develop and prototype. And in some ways, it does give players a lot more flexibility and freedom to explore in ways that they may not be able to in digital. The downside, maybe you don't want that.
Yeah, that's a great point.
The upside, it is ultimately more sustainable from a technical perspective. Yeah, so I think that, I mean, the question is like, what's the experience you're trying to give a player, and what's the modality that's going to get that experience across to them?
That's something we've talked quite a bit about, actually. I was just going to say, Trent, you know, when we talked about archiving materials, how do we think about what's valuable versus not valuable, and who gets to make those decisions? Is it the British Museum, or is it the culture to which those artifacts actually belong? And one of the reasons why I keep going back to the design side of this, partly because that's my job, but also I think a lot about what does it mean to educate people, and what responsibility do we have to make sure that a system is closed versus open, right? So with the world building workshop template we talk about in the book, that is agnostic to somebody's actual worldview. So Trent has said in the past, there's nothing we can do to stop a white supremacist group from creating their perfect white supremacist hellscape, right? That's just a thing they're going to be able to do. On the other hand, I keep thinking about the dearth of Indigenous popular media, and the first thing I think is, well, you know, Trent and I spent a lot of time talking about the fuzzy boundaries of all of these different groups of people and ways of thinking, that you can use world building as an open-ended template to trouble those boundaries and ask, where does something begin or end, and what media do exist that we as a group of world builders can go back to and evaluate to make sense of where some of this stuff was incorporated or excluded, both intentionally or unintentionally, and start evaluating critically, does this particular game, does this particular movie, does this text really do justice to the culture or the language or the people that it's meant to represent, and getting students themselves to think through, am I making the right kinds of decisions, or am I appropriating cultures, or am I creating stereotypes? And I think that's going to be a greater and greater inevitability if you're talking about the number of people who are needed to work on a large scale project. Like, you're just going to have a lot of people who don't have familiarity because they're not content experts in that thing. Can we at least get them to go through that exercise that Trent and I advocate for, which is imagine yourself in someone else's shoes, empathize, try to understand that the framework you see the world through is not the framework. It is just one kind of framework. I think that creates inroads to allowing people to be more critical thinkers about which media exist or don't exist, and what are those representations, and should I really be relying on Red Dead Redemption 2 to tell me something about Indigenous cultures, or maybe there's a better way I could be doing this as a thoughtful individual going out into the world with access to infinite information.
I'm wondering too if there's something with like Mansion to Madness and XCOM or these other games that have an app that mediate your tabletop play. So I'm wondering whether there maybe in the future, I think we tend to think of them as either digital or analog, and there seems to be maybe there's some space in there between to have both. But yeah, sorry, Wendy, I cut you off.
Yeah, I got two big things I want to go back to from what Steven said. First of all, so you said dearth of indigenous media, and I think so. I had a very visceral reaction to that phrase. The implication there is that like there's not any, and I think that we have
Mm.
a paucity at the top level, although we can
Mhm.
point to like Killers of the Flower Moon. We mentioned Reservation Dogs, Echo, that was done in
Hmm.
collaboration with the Choctaw Nation, right? But beyond that, I've actually argued before that I think we're in the middle of a renaissance of amazing indigenous media. Some
Mm.
of it is happening sort of below that, I don't know, AAA or whatever
Triple
you
A,
call
yeah.
it. Yeah, level. There's an amazing Canadian horror movie called Blood Quantum, where it's a zombie flick and native people can't, the zombieism is a virus and native people can't get infected. You can
Mm.
still get killed by a zombie, but you can't become a zombie, right? And so that's like a really cool horror movie. I would say that it is socially engaged. 100% it is. It is also just straight up a gory zombie movie, right? I absolutely love Hallucination, who mixes traditional singing and drumming with like EDM sounds, and they've got a ton of really cool albums. There's also Snotty Nosed Rez Kids that just won a Canadian Music Award. They do more like hip hop and rap, but they're an Indigenous duo. I actually had to teach my daughter what bougie means because they have a song called Bougie Natives. And she was like, Mommy, what does bougie mean? And then as a typical, humanities trained professor, I'm like, well, let's analyze the song. How does he describe a bougie native? Five rings upon his fist. And, like whatever. The Hill Agency is a great sort of like neo-noir point and click adventure game made by an Indigenous Canadian game studio. And then like Indigenous horror is popping off. Strong recommend for The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones,
Yeah.
which is sort of like Stephen King's It, but with a native bend, essentially, right? So there's a ton, and like every media we can think of, like native TikTok is
Mhm.
hilarious. All My Relations is a really cool podcast. So there's not a dearth of indigenous media, but you do need to at least do a Google search for
Yeah. Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it's not going to come on the radio. You're not going to see the previews when you go watch Spider-Man, right?
Mhm.
So you do have to take a little more of an active interest in it, but also there's with the tools of distribution becoming easier for populations to access, there's
Mhm.
so much cool stuff out there. So I wanted to mention that, right? Like, and yes, it's not at the Black Panther, Call of Duty,
Sure.
Madden 20 billion level, right? It's not there, but it doesn't exist.
Mhm.
And then the other thing I wanted to mention, you asked who gets to make decisions about culture and cultural artifacts, and you mentioned like the British Museum, which was interesting because I just went there for the first time this summer, and I've never in my life felt such a profound sense of, well, these things don't belong here, right? Like this isn't where that should be. But I also wanted to just mention it's such a complex issue.
Mhm.
So Haudenosaunee people made beads out of wampum, which is a shell, and then made belts, long beaded belts that were used to sort of like record events, document treaties. One of my favorites, it's called the Two Rose Belt, and it's just a band of white, a band of purple, a band of white, a band of purple, a band of white, right? So two bands of purple separated by white. And it's sort of an agreement with Dutch traders that, like you'll do your thing and we'll do our thing, and we'll go along together along this road of life, but we're not going to cross each other. We're going to
Mm.
be in separate harmony. And I call it the first time anybody said stay in your lane, basically. The stay in your lane belt. So there's an Oneida belt that was created when the Tuscarora Nation joined the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and my nation, Oneida, sponsored them coming in. And so we created the Oneida belt to sort of remember and commemorate that. And that belt currently lives in a museum in Chicago. And I'm gonna tell this story briefly and badly, but there was a point in time when the museum was like, maybe this should be given back. But the Oneida Nation now is not one nation. The original homelands were in New York, and there is still Oneida Indian Nation of New York, who is on those traditional lands. Then my nation, Oneida of Wisconsin, was founded about 200 years ago. We were moved, strongly encouraged to move, choose your verb, and ended up in Wisconsin. And then there's a Oneida of the Thames that's in Canada. So there's these three big Oneida groups. And then the question is, well, at the time the belt was created, we were one nation. We were one Oneida nation. So who does that belt go to, right? And determining who the belt goes to would sort of end up being like a statement about who the real Oneidas are. And so it's a problem, and it couldn't be resolved. And that belt is still in a museum. So the questions, like when you think about like, well, who gets to make about decisions about culture and cultural artifacts? On one hand, it seems like it should be very simple. Well, the Oneida people should make the decision.
Yeah.
But that treats a group as a monolith, and they're not. And there's all sorts of different perspectives and values and beliefs. So sure, people of the culture should make the decision about the artifacts, but like which people and whose voices do we value? That's a much trickier question. It's really hard to address that question. And I think about like, oh, go ahead.
I was just my professor, Michael Wilson, Dr. Michael Wilson at Milwaukee was the one who had this fantastic class, and he was Choctaw. And he's like, people like you were just saying, and he's like, oh, but when the tribal elections start and that machine starts running, it's like it's every bit as mudslinging and nasty and people dragging each other down. It's not like, oh, this is a tribe where we've all got the same goal and we're all going to work together. He's like, it's just as cutthroat as any other kind of political arena. And it's kind of infantilizing.
In harmony, and we're going to hug the trees and smoke peyote and send our messages to creator like, no, we're people.
Yeah, exactly.
We're people, and we have a variety of different opinions and perspectives. I think about Assassin's Creed 3, which had Ginengahaga, a Mohawk character, Dongaheddon, who gets called Connor and all of the marketing, because I assume they don't want to force gamers to say we don't get him. But they worked with the Akwesasne Mohawk community to develop that character, to use Mohawk language, to use parts of the culture that were appropriate, and to like represent the village that he's from and things like that well. But it is still really criticized in the scholarly literature. And one of the reasons is that like at the end of the day, it's not a Ginengahaga story, it's a Assassin's Creed story.
Yeah.
And so we have a character who is half white and half native, who at the end of the day grabs a tomahawk and axes down a bunch of guys, right? And so in some ways, even though they were working very hard to try to do well by this character in this community, there are people that say, well, you're still leaning into all kinds of tropes and stereotypes. And I don't think that the people that make that argument are wrong, and I don't think that the cultural consultants were wrong. And I always think EA is wrong, or that's Ubisoft. We can think they're wrong too. But it's tricky and it's hard. And I think that whenever you want to try to do this kind of work, you just have to accept that you're going to piss somebody off, right? Like, and it might be the very people that you are trying to work with or support. Yay!
So as you're talking, one of the things that I'm wondering about, you had mentioned this recent piece you had composed about Indigenous futurisms. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I'm thinking about the Assassin's Creed 3 and these representations. What is going on in the realm of Indigenous futurisms that you think we should know about?
Oh, great question.
Yeah, Yeah, so Indigenous Futurism is a term that was coined by Grace Dillon, an Anishinaabe scholar, and sort of identifying a trend branching out of Afrofuturisms, which I think
Hmm.
the perhaps most common contemporary touch point is Black Panther, right?
Hmm.
Uh, but observing that in non-native created media, Native people often only appear in historical stories. So things said pre 1920s, right?
Hmm.
We don't really depict Native people in media after that point. And when we do see Native people in sci-fi or things like that, like I'm thinking of Turok, right? Like
Hmm.
Turok is in sci-fi. He might be contemporary, but at least in the video games in general, like he's still a very stereotypical historical presentation of a Native character, right?
Hmm.
In indigenous media, we often see like almost exactly the opposite, right? Native people and contemporary or even future settings demonstrating the culture continuing on, right?
Hmm.
Not just the culture continuing on, but like demonstrating hybridity, that native
Sure.
languages and cultures don't only exist frozen, in a pre-contact moment, and anything that changed or anything that happens after that point is inauthentic. And that's the point that Indigenous Futurism is sort of challenging. So one of the things that I do in the article is look at a couple examples of non-native created games media that depict Native people in the future. One of them is like my absolute favorite game that nobody's heard of from the 90s. It's called Werewolf: The Last Warrior. And it's really interesting because the main character is Native, but the only way that you would know that is if you read the pack-in comic that originally came with the NES cartridge that gives him a backstory and tells you where he came from and how he became this werewolf character, right? So there's no connection to any real Native community, any actual Native values or beliefs or anything like that, right? And then you have something like I had mentioned earlier, Hill Agency, which is created by an Indigenous studio. And they're weaving Anishinaabe the Anishinaabe language, throughout the game. They're blending traditional beadwork styles with futuristic styles. So they're doing a lot of things to project culture into the future. They're also the main story of the game is sort of like a MMIW case. So they're intersecting with contemporary issues, but using sci-fi as a lens to do it. So
Hmm.
that's what the article is about. And I think it kind of relates to some of the things that I've said a couple of times, right? Like this indigenous media is out there if you look for it. And like that's not a story that is going to play on a AAA level, but maybe it doesn't need to, right? Like
Hmm.
maybe it's fine that it doesn't. It's doing something really interesting and niche. And I think it is trying to walk that line of being signaling to native audiences, you're going to recognize these things, you're going to see these things, but also being approachable to non-native audiences.
I do think that bridging is probably the place that I don't know if artists struggle with this. I always look for the most interesting novel things in indie games. I've kind of stopped bothering with most AAA titles because I don't think they're the ones taking creative or intellectual risks in any way. And then when they do try to do things like what you're describing, taking some of this hybridization of cultures and trying to make a statement to the extent that they're making any kind of real artistic statement. But look at something like the Horizon video game series, and it's just cultural appropriation
Yeah.
slapped on top of a AAA produced game. And the premise being we're going to appropriate all of these cultural artifacts or customs, ways of dress, language, whatever, and then we're just going to put it into the future and call it its own thing.
Yeah.
Like that's quite a bit different than the indigenous futurism you're talking about, which is that sort of reimagining or not necessarily reimagining what the world looked like over the last several hundred years,
Mhm.
if not for colonialism, right? Or
Hmm.
in tandem with colonialism and finding a way out of the negative social forces, the antisocial forces that have caused the world to evolve in the way that it has. And I think challenging all of that reminds me a lot of Lovecraft Country, like trying to find ways to use popular culture as a vehicle to make these statements to an audience that otherwise might never have thought to look for it.
Yeah, I think that so if you've heard of like their laundry soap, I think Seventh Generation stole the name from a Haudenosaunee principle that's in our Great Law of Peace. That is, whenever you're thinking about something, a decision, a choice, an action that's going to impact people, you should think 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. So like,
I like that.
not only how is this going to impact me and what do I think about it, but 7 generations back, what would the ancestors think? What would their perspective be? 7 generations forward, how is this going to impact the people who come after me? And I think that in Indigenous futurisms, and like this is the difference between Indigenous futurisms and something like the Horizon games, you have that same idea of this tight braid between past, present, and future, where we're always trying to respect the past, the traditions, the cultures, the ancestors. We're trying to engage with and uplift contemporary people, contemporary struggles, and we're trying to present our values, our way of life, our language, the things that we care about into the future in a way that continues them, right? And that's what the Horizon games are not doing. Like they're not trying to do it.
Right.
But I think that that's the piece that's missing. And you know, when I talked about Assassin's Creed 3, like I love that they decided to have a native character and that they worked with a nation to try to do the best that they can. At the end of the day, they're not telling a Mohawk story, and they're not trying to tell a Mohawk story. They're trying to tell an Assassin's Creed story. And so there's things that they can do, and there's ways that they can use that platform. And then there's things that they're just never gonna be able to do because of the platform that they have and the way that they're using it, right?
That's what, I was thinking too, like one of the things that I think Coyote and Crow, once, I was super excited when Coyote and Crow came out because I'm like, this is really unique. And I think I was going to ask about sort of crowdfunding and being able to find your audience and get funding for it without having to go to Wizards of the Coast and say, like, do we want a native, themed game or whatever. But I think one of the reasons why I admire that project, and talking to a couple students here, they're like, oh, it's highly problematic. A couple of Indigenous students are like, oh, it's not being embraced uncritically by the native community either. But on the other hand, it is such an ambitious and audacious act of imagination, right? To be able to, and it's not like, oh, well, all the white people are bad, and whatever. It's way crunchier than like if we had it all our own way, we would have different problems and different disagreements and different things. And that's where, when I'm teaching my world building classes, I'm always trying to push against, where it's like, if you have the token bad people, like then it could be whatever religion or whatever race or whatever. We've been doing that for thousands of years. Like, let's stop doing that and accept that even if there is what that society, the home society has an enemy, you got to treat them as just as complex and just as, and I mean, it's, one thing is like, oh, well, if they're like flesh-eating demons from another, realm or whatever, maybe we don't need to have their perspective. But that was
one of my students did in my world building class, they did Texas in the future after a climate disaster, and their evil group was the Houston oil barons. And I will say, I was fine with them being dehumanized.
Right. Well, if the shoe fits. It's like, in the Muppet movie, what was the bad guy's name? Tex Oilman or Tex something like that. And of course, conservative groups had a problem with that as well. But I think that that's one of the things too, like it often comes up with, oh, if women were in power, we'd all have peace. And I'm like, I know some women who really crave power.
Who are not peaceful.
Yeah, and I don't think that they, So it's one of those things, too, where I think the idea, and this is something, too, that just from our own pedagogical training, and I'm sure you're on board with this, too, you got to make mistakes, you got to try, you got to get things out there. And in a creative mode, you're way more likely to have your guard down and maybe let a slip of, like, oh, well, then you have somebody else come up and say like, actually, that's not a very good representation. It's more of a, sort of an essentialist claim than it is, whatever. And that's where too, like, I'm hoping that as we move into, whatever post-apocalyptic future we're going to be moving into, that those spaces of just sort of like playful, and like get it wrong and then be corrected and understand why it was wrong for you to have said, like, not with shame, because it's like you were saying, when I went through K through 12, I grew up in Green Bay and the United Nations right there. Do you want to take a wild guess how many classes or how many units or how many assignments of how many classes we had? Because there was none, right? And it's like, and we live there, right?
Yeah.
So how would you not grow up and be a 20 or 30-year-old and make an assumption or make a mistake? And then this is where I just feel like we got to get a lot better of having that corrected in a way that isn't going to turn somebody off, and then also a way is that actually educational rather than like coming to blows. And I have a naive sort of hope that like creativity in games and play and all those kind of things, because this is where you were saying too, like, you just don't want to throw on the wardrobe and be like, okay, well now I'm this person. And in some ways that's exactly what tabletop role-playing games ask you to do, right? But there's no wood elves to correct you. You know what I mean? Like when you post your blog, there's no wood elf who takes exception to it. And I think that that's where just all of the like quick indignation on both sides to get really angry about how do you not understand all of this stuff. I think that needs to bubble down a little bit, simmer a little bit, so people can actually have meaningful conversations of why did you say that to begin with? Why was that your perception? And let me explain why that is wrong. But, when you're in a world that's run by Zuckerberg and Bezos, it's hard to see a future they're coming. But that's where, too, I think the indie thing is going to be where it's at, right? Indie, homebrew, you know what I mean? Low cost, low stakes, because it's certainly not going to get there through the AAA industries. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter whether they're talking video games or high culture or whatever. But that's the hope, is that we can create through games more ways of connection, more patterns of understanding, and not very disposable one shot. Now I understand this thing, but actually getting into the weeds with it's not so easy. Like people are people. Doesn't matter what culture, doesn't matter what time. Human beings are complex things, and it's never, it's the whole thing with the generalization is that when we do when you do Western history or whatever, Western Civ, you have to flatten all of that history in order to move through it in 15 weeks. And it's like, well, maybe the answer is then not flattening it, right? Or at least having it have places where like you're really engaged in a much more, I would pause to say authentic, but at least a little less manicured with political borders clearly drawn out, right? That's not the way those people experienced it. That's not the way, or the idea that when people are coming from Europe and they're finding the Americas, that they have their whole worldview, and the people in the Americas have their whole worldview, and there's a lot of differentiation between the people who have those very specific worldviews, right? And then you blend them together, and it's like, what the fuck? Like, you know what I mean? Like, how can anybody understand what anybody's thinking? And I always feel like it's dumbed down and overly generalized in order to just move past it quickly. Yeah. And that's where holding on to some of this stuff without actually having one of the things that Steve always says, and I've said this in a million of these things, is like ask better questions, right? So like maybe you play a game and at the end of the game you don't have any more answers, but you've got a lot more better questions that then you can go find out, and it, interrogate some of your assumptions, if I can be the, put it in academic.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. Like, people don't know what they don't know. And I also think sometimes it's hard to recognize the bubbles when you're in. And I'll give two little examples. My daughter goes to probably 6 to 8 powwows a year. Like when it's powwow season, that's just what you do on the weekend, is go to powwow. And I have heard her when, she'll have a play date or something and she's talking to, other 7, 10-year-olds. And she'll just ask them, like, how many powwows have you been to? And they're like, how many what? She's like, like powwow, how many powwows? But that's just such a part of her experience that it's weird to her that there are people that have not been to a powwow, right? Much less double digits worth of powwows. Meanwhile, at work, I have explained on multiple occasions why it is considered offensive to use powwow if you're not referencing a powwow, right? Like you have a meeting, not a powwow. A powwow is an actual thing. But there's a long history there involving laws and suppression of culture and things like that. And I've explained this to many people who didn't realize that like powwows are actually a real thing. Like that happen, again, most weekends when it's powwow season, right? And so, you have people that are in their bubbles but don't realize it's a bubble.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have people that like don't even know that there's a Google search to be done, right?
Right.
They're missing that level of knowledge. And so I think on both ends of the spectrum, more empathy and kindness is the answer, right? Like, are people using things at times in an offensive, derogatory way? Sure, they are.
Yeah.
Sure. But I don't know, at least to keep getting up in the morning and drinking my coffee, I choose to believe that most people aren't that way, right? And I've given talks where people have like run down a list of, can I say this word? Well, can I say that word? Well, can I say this word?
Right.
And I'm thinking of one in particular where afterwards the older white gentleman that was asking me those questions came up and was just like, thank you so much for explaining that to me. I had no idea about any of this. And it's sort of like once he had someone who could explain things, he was not trying to be rude or offensive. He genuinely wanted to know, like,
Yeah.
why can't I use these words?
Yeah. The generational aspect there too, right? Probably comes into play. So
Sure, but I think, as you mentioned, I think about that with my students a lot as well. They didn't choose their K-12 education. They didn't choose what they learned. They're making choices now, but even those choices are highly constrained. So,
and constructed in a certain way. That's what I was
yeah.
thinking about. My professor Michael Wilson was saying, somebody asked him how he preferred, and he's like, well, I just like Indian. You know what I mean? Like, oh, Indigenous or Native American or whatever you want. He's like, I just like Indian. Like that's what it's been for a long time. Just call me that, and that's totally fine. And but your mileage will vary based on different people, right?
Yeah, I will say to anybody listening, Native American, if you're talking about somebody in the US, is 100% the safest. I would not roll in with Indian because some people will get very offended by that. But at the same time, my grandma does not like Indigenous. She says like weeds are indigenous, people aren't indigenous. And she grew up being called Indian and she wants to be called an Indian. And I am absolutely not going to tell an elder how to identify. I am also not going to tell my students to go around calling people Indians because there are a lot of people that would not appreciate that.
Yeah.
And that just goes back to, this kind of conversation that we've been having about how these things they're communal, but they're also individual, right? They're social and they're personal at the same time. And navigating that as thoughtfully as you can with the best intention that you can, I think is the best you can do. And sometimes you discover that you could have done better and you learn that for the future. And sometimes you have to expect that no one will be happy with anything that,
I'm trying to think of any work of fiction that actually delves into that at that same level. Tolkien gets close with his elves, right? I mean, it's like, well, then he was called this and his name was that, but he was called this by that. And it's like, well, it's because you've got 14 names to remember for everybody, right? And that's just in a fantasy world. So I think it's that same desire to have something simplified that isn't simplified. And that's what I always try and do in world building is be like, no, you want to make it complex and then hand wave that complexity away as much as you possibly can, to be like, it matters, but for our story, like you were just saying about Assassin's Creed, this is the story you're telling. So it's not that complexity doesn't exist. It's that complexity does not come into this story, right? And then you've always got the option of turning around and writing another story in which maybe that is at the core. But you can't tackle the extreme complexity of our world in every game, in every story, in everything. You need at some point to make some choices.
I use the world building framework and my world building class, and we do some outlines over every piece of it. But I do tell them to pick just a few of those categories and build your complexity there. And we talk about how the choice to simplify is a rhetorical choice. When you add depth in one place, you are choosing actively to take it out of somewhere else.
Yeah.
And you have to, like, you can't. I mean, you could write an encyclopedia that would let you do depth everywhere you want. But, if you're not doing that, you have to choose to simplify. And then again, you're trying to make the best choice for the purpose that you have, what you want to convey, the story, what have you.
And that circles us Sorry.
I was just going to say, Steve, to throw it to you, a point of intentionality, right? What Mike Young was saying about intentionality. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was going to say too, is it all circles us right back to where we started, which is the critical thinking and empathy part of this, that the goal is to help people understand the limits of their own understanding. And like Trent said, help them ask better questions so that down the road, when they're considering, for whatever world building purpose they have, whether that's writing something or creating a movie or even just playing a game with their action figures, it's thinking through, what is the story I'm telling and what does it say about my value system or principles? And sometimes that's communicated to a broader audience and sometimes it's not. And it's just about how are you traveling through reality. And when you run into a vote for your local town council, are you thinking about those things? As much as it is the big picture stuff, it's all macro and micro. I just really appreciate the degree to which you have explored a lot of these things in your own work, because they're really important. And I feel like not enough people take them into account when they think about design, when they think about storytelling, when they think about world building.
To become more popular. That's your goal.
Yeah, I guess that's it. That's the lesson.
I'll work on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Or maybe I want to stay niche.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, I think this is probably a good place to end. And I want to thank you again, Wendi, for taking the time to talk with Trent and I and share your knowledge, wisdom with the people who are listening, all 5 of our listeners.
Yes,
so hopefully they'll get something out of this. I certainly did. And it's just really good to see you. So thanks for taking the time.
Awesome. Well, I do want to, just a little clip, I don't know, to end, say,
sure.
Wagatsinini, G was Wagedod, Yawango, which means I am very grateful that everyone was here. And thank you very much.
Awesome. I really hope I get to see you in person sometime soon. It seemed like we had a good streak going when you were living in Rochester, but
invite me for a guest lecture sometime.
Yeah, I know. I'm dead.
I keep telling him that, and it's not happened yet. But
no, I know. Maybe. Well, it's because money. I mean, go figure. Yeah. It's like harder and harder to come by money. So anyway,
wouldn't be one of our episodes if we didn't complain about capitalism a little bit.
Exactly. She's a huge fan of capitalism, though, so it's a good thing we didn't touch on it.
I actually have a lovely clip to share about tribal capitalism from Rutherford Falls that is very interesting. You can put in the show notes.
Yeah. Oh, please do. I would love to include that. Okay, well, good to see you. Good to see Trent. We'll talk to you all later. We'll have something new and interesting next time around, and we appreciate you tuning in.
Don't make those promises, but we'll have something next time, right?
Okay. We'll have something.
All right, we'll talk to you all later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. The World Building Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Stephen Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Stephen Slota. The companion text, The World Building Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Stephen Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.